He thought humiliating her would entertain the room, but he had no idea he was about to resurrect a ghost the world had already mourned. The grand hall shimmered under warm golden chandeliers, the kind that made every polished surface glow like quiet wealth. And at the center of it all sat Victor Langford, a name that filled concert halls across America, a man whose fingers were said to turn ivory keys into something close to divine. The audience leaned forward in anticipation, dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns, the soft rustle of fabric and low murmurs blending into the kind of refined noise that only existed in places where tickets cost more than most people's monthly rent. And yet, in the far corner of the room, almost swallowed by shadow, sat a woman who did not belong, at least, not by appearance. Eleanor Hayes wore a simple gray dress, the kind you might pass without a second glance, her shoes slightly worn, her posture quiet but steady, as if she carried something heavier than the room could see. She hadn't spoken since she arrived. She hadn't needed to. But Victor noticed her. Of course he did. Men like him always noticed what didn't fit. His eyes lingered just a moment too long, a faint smirk forming as he leaned into the microphone, the spotlight catching the sharp confidence in his expression. "You ever wonder," he said lightly, his voice smooth and practiced, "what happens when someone completely untrained sits at a concert grand?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience, polite at first, then growing bolder as they sensed where this was going. Victor stood, adjusting his jacket, and began to walk, slowly, deliberately, toward the back rows. The marble floor echoed beneath his shoes, each step measured, each second stretching the tension just a little further. And then he stopped, right in front of her. Eleanor didn't look up immediately. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, fingers still, almost too still, as if they had long ago learned the discipline of silence. "Ma'am," Victor said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear, "would you do us the honor of trying?" Laughter louder this time. Not cruel enough to be called outright mockery, but sharp enough to sting. The kind of laughter that assumes failure before it even begins. Eleanor slowly raised her eyes. They were steady, not defiant, not afraid, just certain. For a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, something Victor didn't recognize and didn't bother to understand. To him, this was a moment, a joke, a performance within a performance. He gestured toward the stage, inviting her forward with a theatrical politeness that barely concealed the trap. "Come on," he added, smiling wider. "It'll be fun." The audience shifted, leaning in, hungry for the spectacle. No one expected anything remarkable. No one ever did. And as Eleanor finally stood, smoothing the front of her simple dress, the room seemed to hold its breath, not out of respect, but out of curiosity for how badly this would go. What Victor didn't see, what none of them saw, was the quiet weight behind her steps, the invisible history carried in the way her shoulders stayed relaxed, the way her gaze never wavered as she walked toward the stage. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one thinks twice about. And sometimes, the past doesn't disappear, it waits. Victor watched her walk toward the stage with the faint amusement of a man who had already decided how the story would end, his fingers casually brushing the edge of the grand piano, as if reminding everyone who it belonged to. And as Eleanor stepped into the light, the contrast became almost theatrical, the soft glow of the chandelier, catching the simplicity of her dress, the quiet composure in her face. And for a moment the room leaned forward not out of respect, but curiosity, the kind that comes just before disappointment, because they believed they were about to witness something awkward, something forgettable, something that would confirm what they already thought about people like her. Victor returned to his bench, not sitting yet, letting the silence stretch just enough to keep control of the room. Then he spoke again with a tone that carried just enough charm to disguise the edge beneath it, saying that since she was now part of the performance, she might as well try something real, something worthy of the stage. And without waiting for her answer, he announced a piece known among serious musicians as Unforgiving, a composition filled with rapid passages, layered emotion, and precision that even trained pianists respected with caution, a piece chosen not for beauty but for difficulty, because failure would be undeniable. A few heads in the audience nodded in recognition, a quiet murmur spreading as they understood the setup, and somewhere in the front row a man let out a soft chuckle, already anticipating the collapse of whatever confidence this woman might have carried onto the stage. Eleanor stood beside the piano, her gaze resting briefly on the keys, not intimidated, not impressed, simply observing, and for a second Victor tilted his head as if expecting hesitation, but she did not give it to him. Instead, she moved with a calm that did not match the situation, pulling the bench slightly, adjusting it with small, precise movements, the kind that came from habit rather than guesswork. And though most people did not notice, a few in the room shifted in their seats, sensing something they could not yet explain. Victor stepped back, folding his arms loosely, the faint smile still on his face, but his eyes lingered a little longer now, searching for signs of uncertainty, for the small cracks that would confirm his expectations, yet Eleanor offered none. She sat down slowly, her posture straight but relaxed, her hands resting lightly above her lap, not touching the keys yet, as if the moment itself required patience. The room began to stir, the earlier amusement fading into a thin layer of impatience, whispers weaving through the silence, people checking watches, adjusting in their seats, waiting for the inevitable misstep that would release them into laughter again. But Eleanor did not rush. She simply breathed in, steady and controlled, her eyes lowering to the piano as if everything else in the room had already disappeared. And in that stillness there was something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to someone out of place, something that felt practiced, intentional, almost reverent. Victor noticed it then, just for a flicker of a second, the way her fingers hovered slightly, not trembling, not unsure, but remembering, and the smile on his face tightened almost imperceptibly, because for the first time that evening, the outcome did not feel entirely predictable. The audience, however, had not yet caught up, still waiting for the joke to land, still believing this was all part of the same harmless entertainment, unaware that the silence stretching across the hall was no longer empty. It was gathering weight, and that weight was about to change everything. He thought silence meant hesitation, but what he was really witnessing was control, the kind that only comes from someone who has spent years mastering not just the instrument but the space around it. And as Eleanor finally lifted her hands, the room unconsciously leaned forward again, though no one could quite explain why, because nothing had happened yet, not a single note had been played, and still the atmosphere had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks across a quiet sky. Her fingers hovered above the keys, curved with precision, not stiff, not uncertain, but shaped by memory. And in that small detail something inside the room began to unravel, though most people could not name it. Victor remained standing just a few feet away, arms still crossed, but his posture had changed, the casual ease replaced by a faint tension in his shoulders, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle that should not exist. He had seen amateurs before, many of them, and they all shared the same signs, the same nervous energy, the same clumsy uncertainty, but this was different, and difference, in a room built on expectation, was dangerous. Eleanor lowered her hands gently onto the keys, not striking them, just resting, as if greeting something familiar after a long absence, and for a brief second her eyes closed, not for effect, not for drama, but for alignment, as though she was listening to something deeper than the room itself. A faint whisper moved through the audience, a ripple of impatience mixed with curiosity, people shifting in their seats, adjusting their programs, waiting for the inevitable mistake that would justify their earlier laughter, but the longer the silence stretched, the less certain they became, because this no longer felt like a joke unfolding. It felt like something else entirely, something that demanded attention. Then, without warning, the first note arrived, soft but exact, landing with a clarity that cut cleanly through the air, not loud, not showy, but deliberate, and it was followed by another, and another, each one placed with intention, forming the beginning of a phrase that did not belong to hesitation, it belonged to understanding. Victor's expression flickered, just for a moment, the smallest fracture in his confidence, because he recognized that touch, the control of weight, the balance between restraint and sound, and it was not something a casual player could imitate. The audience did not react immediately, not because they were unimpressed, but because they were recalibrating, their expectations lagging behind what they were hearing, trying to reconcile the image in front of them with the sound filling the hall. Eleanor continued, her movements fluid now, no longer testing, no longer tentative, her hands gliding across the keyboard with a quiet authority that began to reshape the room itself. And somewhere in the front row a woman who had been smiling earlier slowly lowered her program. Her eyes fixed on the stage, the smile gone. The music grew, not in volume, but in presence, each note carrying weight, each phrase unfolding with a precision that spoke of years, not moments. And Victor felt it then, unmistakably, the shift from control to uncertainty, the realization that whatever he had intended this to be was slipping beyond his grasp. He did not interrupt. He could not, because to do so now would expose something far worse than a failed joke. It would expose that he had misjudged, and in a room like this, misjudgment carried consequences that applause could not erase. Eleanor did not look at him, did not acknowledge the audience, did not seek approval or reaction. She simply played, as if the piano and the music and the silence in between were the only things that existed. And as the melody deepened, the laughter that had once filled the hall seemed almost impossible to remember, replaced now by something far heavier, something that settled into every seat, every breath, every heartbeat in the room, until at last, without anyone announcing it, without anyone deciding it, the entire hall fell completely, utterly still. What began as curiosity was now turning into disbelief, and disbelief, in a room built on certainty, was the most dangerous shift of all, because the moment people begin to question what they think they understand, everything else starts to unravel with it. And as Eleanor's playing continued, it was no longer just technically precise. It carried something deeper, something layered, something that did not simply follow the structure of the piece Victor had announced, but subtly reshaped it, bending phrases, extending pauses, revealing an interpretation that only someone with true mastery would dare attempt. The audience felt it before they understood it, the way the music no longer sounded like a performance, but like a memory being brought back to life, each note placed not just with skill, but with intention, as if it carried history within it. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes fixed on her hands now, no longer scanning for mistakes, but searching for recognition, because what he was hearing was not unfamiliar, it was impossible, and that difference mattered. A man seated near the front leaned forward, his brows furrowing, his lips parting as if trying to recall something just out of reach, and beside him a woman slowly shook her head, not in disagreement, but in quiet realization that something about this moment did not align with the narrative they had all accepted when they walked into the hall. Eleanor did not rush the tempo, did not chase applause. She allowed the music to breathe, stretching certain passages just enough to create tension, then resolving them with a softness that settled over the room like a quiet confession. And with every passing second, the distance between who they thought she was and who she truly was grew wider, until it became impossible to ignore. Victor shifted his weight slightly, a small movement, but one that betrayed the loss of control he had so carefully maintained, because this was no longer his stage in the way he had intended. The spotlight still belonged to him by design, but in reality, it had already moved, already chosen its true center. The piece evolved under her hands, no longer bound by expectation, revealing complexities that even seasoned listeners rarely experienced. And somewhere in the room a soft voice whispered a single word, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to ripple through those closest, no, as if denying what they were beginning to see. Eleanor's expression remained unchanged, calm, focused, untouched by the shifting energy around her, as though she had stepped outside of the room entirely, into a space where judgment did not exist, where the music was not a performance, but a language she had never forgotten how to speak. Victor felt it now with absolute clarity, the unmistakable presence of someone who did not belong beneath him, but beside him, or perhaps beyond him, and the realization did not arrive as a sudden shock. It settled slowly, heavily, like a truth he could not reject, but was not ready to accept. The audience, once restless, was now completely still, every eye fixed on the stage, every breath measured. The earlier laughter erased so completely it felt as though it had never existed, replaced by something far more fragile, something that demanded silence. And as Eleanor's hands moved with increasing confidence, weaving through passages that required not just technique, but understanding earned over years. The final barrier broke, the last trace of doubt dissolving into recognition, not spoken, not announced, but felt collectively. And in that shared, unspoken moment, the room understood that this was no accident. This was no coincidence. This was something they had not been prepared to witness, something that had been hidden in plain sight until now. And there was no going back to what they had believed just minutes before. By now, the music was no longer something the audience was listening to. It was something they were inside of, something that wrapped around the room and held it in place. And Eleanor did not simply play the piece Victor had chosen. She transformed it, revealing layers that most performers never touched, turning technical difficulty into emotional clarity. And with every passing phrase, the truth became harder to deny, because this was not talent discovered in a moment. This was mastery forged over years, the kind that leaves marks no one can fake. Victor stood completely still now, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by a quiet, tightening awareness that something irreversible was happening. And though he did not move, his presence had already diminished, no longer the center, no longer the authority, just a man standing beside a reality he had failed to see. Eleanor's hands moved with precision and ease, crossing registers, balancing dynamics, shaping the sound with a control that spoke of deep familiarity. And as she reached the most demanding passages, the ones designed to expose weakness, she did not struggle, she did not hesitate, she leaned into them, allowing the complexity to unfold naturally, as if the music itself had been waiting for her return. In the front rows, faces that once carried amusement were now marked by recognition, not just of skill, but of identity, something forming beneath the surface, a memory connecting to the present. And then it happened, quiet but unmistakable. A man in the second row, older, his hair silver and his posture refined, leaned forward sharply, his eyes widening as if a name had just surfaced in his mind after years of absence. And he whispered, barely audible, but enough for those near him to hear. That phrasing, "It cannot be." The words did not need to be completed, because the realization was already spreading, subtle at first, then stronger, like a current moving through the room, people exchanging glances, searching each other's expressions for confirmation, because what they were beginning to understand carried weight beyond the performance itself. Eleanor continued without interruption, her focus absolute, her presence calm, as though none of it mattered, as though she had not noticed the shift. But in truth, she had always known this moment would arrive, not as a surprise, but as something inevitable. Victor's gaze dropped briefly to the floor, just for a second, a small, almost imperceptible break, but enough to reveal that he, too, was beginning to understand. And that understanding did not come with relief, it came with consequence, because the more clearly the room saw her, the more clearly they would remember him, and the role he had played, not just tonight, but long before. The final movement approached, the music building not in volume but in depth, every note carrying purpose, every transition seamless. And when Eleanor reached the closing passage, she did not rush to finish, she allowed it to settle, to breathe, to say what it needed to say without force. And as the last note faded into the air, there was no immediate applause, no sudden reaction, just silence, complete and undeniable, the kind that only exists when something true has just been revealed. Victor did not clap. He did not speak. He simply stood there, the weight of the moment pressing against him, as the room, once filled with laughter, now held nothing but realization. And in that stillness, the balance had shifted completely, not through confrontation, not through words, but through something far more powerful, something that could not be argued, could not be dismissed, something that left no room for doubt. The silence did not break right away. It deepened, stretching across the hall like something sacred that no one dared disturb. And for a moment, time itself seemed to pause, suspended between what had just happened and what it meant, because recognition does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, settling into the mind with a weight that cannot be ignored. Eleanor's hands rested gently on her lap now, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had not just altered the atmosphere of an entire room filled with critics, patrons, and seasoned musicians, as if this had never been about them at all. Then, somewhere near the front, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant at first, almost uncertain, but it did not take long, because truth, once seen, spreads quickly, and within seconds the applause grew, rising not in polite appreciation, but in something far more powerful, something closer to respect, the kind that cannot be faked, the kind that is earned in moments exactly like this. People stood, one by one, not out of obligation, but because remaining seated suddenly felt wrong, and the sound filled the hall, echoing off the marble and glass, a sharp contrast to the laughter that had existed there just minutes before. Victor did not join them. He remained where he was, his hands at his sides, his face composed but no longer confident, because applause in this moment did not belong to him, and he understood that better than anyone. The older man in the second row stood slowly, his eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that suggested memory rather than surprise, and when he spoke, his voice carried just enough to reach those nearby. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, the name landing with quiet force, and as it spread from person to person, whispered, repeated, questioned, the room began to shift again, this time not from doubt to belief, but from ignorance to realization. It was not just that she could play, it was that she had been someone known, someone respected, someone who had vanished from the world that now stood applauding her return. Victor's eyes lifted at the sound of her name, and in that instant, the final piece fell into place, not as a revelation but as a confirmation of something he should have recognized earlier, something he had overlooked because he had never considered the possibility that someone like her could stand in front of him again. Eleanor rose slowly from the bench, not acknowledging the applause with a bow, not seeking the attention that was now undeniably hers, but simply standing, her gaze moving briefly across the room, not searching for validation, not claiming victory, just observing, as if measuring the distance between what they had believed and what they now understood. The applause began to soften, not because it was undeserved, but because something deeper had taken its place, a quiet awareness that this moment was not just about music, it was about misjudgment, about assumption, about the cost of underestimating someone who chose silence over display. Victor finally took a step back, a small movement, but one that spoke louder than anything he could have said, because for the first time that evening, he was no longer in control of the narrative, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. Eleanor turned slightly, her hand brushing the edge of the piano one last time, not with ownership, not with nostalgia, but with quiet acknowledgement, and as she stepped away from the spotlight, leaving behind the stage that had been used against her, the room did not follow her with noise. It followed her with something far more lasting, something that would remain long after the applause had faded, because in that moment, every person present understood a truth that could not be undone, that greatness does not need permission to exist, and that respect, once lost in arrogance, is not easily reclaimed. The applause lingered even as Eleanor moved away from the piano, not fading so much as transforming into something quieter, something more reflective, and people did not immediately return to their seats because they understood, even if only instinctively, that they had just witnessed something that could not be reduced to entertainment, something that demanded a different kind of attention. Eleanor walked with the same steady pace she had when she first approached the stage, her expression unchanged, her gaze neither lifted in pride nor lowered in avoidance, but level, grounded, as if the weight of the room had never settled on her shoulders in the first place. A few individuals near the aisle instinctively stepped aside to give her space, a subtle shift that spoke volumes, because minutes ago she had been invisible to them, and now they adjusted their presence in response to hers without even thinking. The older man who had spoken her name remained standing, his eyes following her with a mixture of respect and disbelief, and as she passed, he gave a slight nod, not as recognition alone, but as acknowledgement of something restored, something that had been missing for far longer than anyone had realized. Eleanor returned the gesture with the smallest incline of her head, a quiet exchange that needed no words, then continued walking, her hands relaxed at her sides, no longer hovering over keys, no longer proving anything. Behind her, the stage remained lit, the grand piano still at its center, but it no longer felt like Victor's domain, not in the way it had at the beginning of the evening, and the audience, still standing, gradually turned their attention back toward him, not with admiration, but with a different kind of expectation, one that had not existed before. Victor felt it immediately, the shift in their gaze, the absence of the easy authority he once carried, and though he straightened slightly, adjusting his posture as if to reclaim some part of it, the effort did not land the same way, because confidence, once cracked, does not return on command. He stepped forward slowly, the sound of his shoes on the marble echoing in a way that now felt exposed rather than commanding. And for a brief moment, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words did not come, not because he lacked them, but because none of them fit the moment anymore. There was no clever remark that could restore what had been lost, no light joke that could redirect the energy of the room, because this was no longer his performance to control. The audience waited, not impatiently, but attentively, and in that attention there was a quiet demand, not for explanation, but for acknowledgement, something Victor had not planned to give. His eyes moved across the room, catching fragments of expression, raised brows, steady gazes, the absence of laughter, and finally, almost against his own instinct, he looked toward the aisle where Eleanor had just walked, but she was already near the exit, already beyond the reach of the spotlight, already choosing distance over recognition. That, more than anything, unsettled him, because it meant she had not stayed for validation, had not needed the applause, had not required the room to confirm her worth. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and lowered his gaze for a fraction of a second, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed in any other context. But here, now, it carried weight, because it was the closest thing to concession he was capable of offering. The room did not react with noise. It reacted with stillness, the kind that follows when something unspoken has been understood by everyone present. And as Victor finally stepped back from the center of the stage, not in defeat, but in quiet recognition of what had just occurred, the balance of the evening settled into a new shape, one that no longer revolved around reputation or expectation, but around something far more enduring, something that had revealed itself without asking permission and could not be undone. Outside the hall, the night air felt different, quieter, as if the world beyond those polished doors had not yet caught up to what had just unfolded inside, and Eleanor stepped onto the sidewalk without hesitation, the soft hum of distant traffic and city lights replacing the echo of applause, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged, as though she had simply completed something long overdue rather than extraordinary. Behind her, through the tall glass entrance, silhouettes of guests could still be seen gathered in clusters, their movements animated now. Conversations sparked with a kind of urgency that only comes when people realize they have witnessed something rare, something they were not prepared to understand in the moment, but cannot stop thinking about afterward. Names began to circulate more clearly now, spoken with certainty rather than doubt, stories resurfacing, fragments of memory piecing themselves together, and among them, the truth of Eleanor Hayes began to take shape again, not as a rumor, but as recognition restored. Inside, Victor remained near the stage, no longer attempting to command attention, because the room had already moved past that, and even as a few approached him, their expressions polite but altered, there was an undeniable shift in the way they looked at him, not with the same admiration, not with the same unquestioned respect, but with a quiet awareness that something important had been revealed, and not in his favor. He responded where necessary, nodding, offering brief acknowledgments. But his usual ease was absent, replaced by a restraint that suggested he understood the weight of the moment more than he would ever admit out loud. Back outside, Eleanor paused briefly near the curb, glancing up at the night sky for just a second, the city lights reflecting faintly in her eyes, not with longing, not with regret, but with a calm sense of closure, as if a chapter that had remained unfinished for years had finally reached its natural end. A car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the pavement, and for a moment her shadow stretched long beside her, then faded again, leaving her standing alone, exactly as she had entered, unnoticed by most, but no longer unseen. A young couple exiting the hall caught sight of her and hesitated, recognition flickering across their faces, and though they did not approach, they watched her for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to reconcile the quiet woman before them with the presence they had just experienced on stage. Eleanor offered no performance for them, no acknowledgement. She simply continued walking, her steps steady, her figure gradually blending into the rhythm of the street, becoming part of the ordinary world again, but carrying with her something that the extraordinary had not changed, only revealed. Inside, the conversations grew louder, more certain, as the narrative solidified, and one phrase began to echo more than others, not spoken as gossip, but as realization, that she had never truly disappeared, she had only stepped away, and tonight had not been a return for the sake of recognition, but a reminder, quiet and undeniable, of what had always been there. Victor eventually moved toward the side of the stage, no longer at its center, his presence now defined not by performance, but by reflection, and as he glanced once more toward the piano, still illuminated under the lights, untouched since Eleanor had left it, there was no applause waiting for him there, no laughter to rely on, only the lingering weight of what had been revealed, and the understanding that some moments do not need confrontation to deliver their message, they only need truth to stand long enough to be seen, and once seen, they do not fade. By the time the hall began to empty, the energy of the night had already settled into something that would not easily be forgotten. Conversations drifting into quieter tones, not out of politeness but reflection, as if each person carried a slightly different version of the same realization, and none of them felt the need to raise their voice about it. The grand piano remained on stage, untouched, its polished surface still catching the light, but it no longer symbolized prestige or performance. It stood as a silent witness to a moment that had shifted more than just perception, something that had exposed the fragile line between assumption and truth. Victor lingered longer than most, not because he had somewhere to be, but because leaving too quickly would have felt like avoidance, and staying required him to face what had unfolded without the protection of applause or control. He walked slowly toward the piano, his steps measured, his expression composed but thoughtful, and when he reached it, he rested his hand lightly on its edge, the same gesture he had made earlier, but now it carried a different meaning, no longer ownership, but acknowledgement. He did not sit down. He did not play. Instead, he stood there for a moment, looking at the keys as if seeing them differently, as if understanding that mastery was not something granted by reputation alone, but something that revealed itself regardless of who was watching. Outside, Eleanor had already disappeared into the rhythm of the city, her presence blending seamlessly into the ordinary, but the impact she left behind continued to move through the people who had witnessed it, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, shaping the way they thought, the way they judged, the way they remembered. A few guests stepped out into the night and paused instinctively, scanning the sidewalk as if hoping to catch one last glimpse of her, but she was gone, not in a way that felt like loss, but in a way that felt complete, as though she had never needed to stay for the ending. Back inside, the final staff members began to dim the lights, the golden glow softening into shadow, and as the room grew quieter, the absence of earlier laughter became more noticeable, not because it had been replaced, but because it had been rendered irrelevant. Victor finally stepped away from the piano, his posture straight, his movements controlled, but there was a subtle change in the way he carried himself, something less certain, more aware, as if the evening had introduced a perspective he could not ignore. He walked toward the exit without drawing attention, blending into the remaining crowd, no longer the center of focus, and for perhaps the first time in a long while, that did not seem like something he could easily change. The doors opened, the night air welcomed him, and as he stepped outside, he paused briefly, his gaze moving across the street, not searching for her specifically, but acknowledging the space she had already moved beyond. There were no words exchanged, no confrontation, no apology spoken, and yet something had been said more clearly than any conversation could have delivered, something that did not require agreement to exist. And as the city continued on, indifferent and steady, the truth of the evening remained where it belonged, not in the spotlight, not in applause, but in the quiet understanding that had settled into every person who had been there, a reminder that dignity does not announce itself, it reveals itself, and when it does, the world has no choice but to recognize it.